steps are not made for these vehicles. But I am so thrilled to be here. This is an important day. It's now called Patriots Day. And I won't be spending a lot of time talking about that alone, but I will be speaking about freedom and how far some people are willing to go to get it. And in some ways, that search for freedom is the reason why all of us are here on this soil, in this place, at this time, because someone in all of our backgrounds, one way or the other, had to have done what the people in the book that I've written about did just for us to be here. It's just a question of how long ago did they do it, how far back in our background someone might have done this. Was it your grandparents, your great-grandparents, or lots and lots of greats to get us to where we are right now. So I'm going to show you a copy of my book, which looks different from the one that those of you in the upper grades may have read. This is mine. You see it looks really, really worn out. And it's a representation in many respects of the hard work that went into making it. So this talk really is about hard work and freedom and what it took for us to be here. Now, as you know, it took me 15 years to work on this book. How many of you are 15? Anybody 15? That means that I began working on, actually it's longer than that. It took me as long as you have been alive for me to write this book. That's a very long time. And that's an indication, I hope to you, of how important I think it is, what it is that I wrote about. What would anyone spend 15 years working on? This story, The Great Migration, is really about people who are proxies for someone in all of our backgrounds who had to have done what these people did just for us to be here. Let me describe to you the world that they were in that made it necessary for them to seek freedom within the borders of their own country. This is the only time in our country's history that people who had to leave the land of their birth for someplace far, far away within the borders of their own country, just to be recognized as the citizens to which they had been born. No other group of Americans has ever had to do that. And that's why this is a really unusual and special kind of thing to be thinking about on a day when we think about freedom. Let me describe to you the world that they were living in. They were living in a world, and this is about the 20th century, the century in which all of us were born. To do the math on that, yes. All of us were born in the 20th century. This occurred in the 20th century within the lifespan of your grandparents, perhaps even of your parents. And that was a world in which in the American South, it was actually against the law for a black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. It was against the law. Someone must have seen a black person and a white person playing checkers together in some town square and thought that maybe they were having too good of a time, and they decided that it was going to threaten the very foundation of Southern civilization, and they said, we cannot allow that. And actually sat down and wrote that down as a law. In courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a black Bible and a separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on. That meant that in courtrooms throughout the South, the two races could not even touch the same sacred object. It was against the law. Now let me tell you how I found out about that. How I found out about that was I was going through all the research and going through the archives, looking at newspapers to find out what was life like in those days. You know, we grow up and hear about these things such as the water fountains and the restrooms that were colored and white in the South throughout much of the 20th century. But we know about that already because everybody learns that in February, right? We all know that. This was about a world in which every single thing that could be devised to separate people who otherwise might have been the best of friends was devised to keep people apart. And that hurt people on all sides of this thing. So I found out about this because I was looking for things that were beyond all the things that we know. And I came across this newspaper article in which there was a headline that talked about the Jim Crow Bible. I thought, how in the world could you segregate the very Word of God? And they had found a way to do that. And what had happened was, this made the news not because they were embarrassed about this. This happened to have been in North Carolina. It only made the news that day because on that particular day there was a trial in session, and they had to suspend the trial. They had to stop the trial right in mid-trial because they could not find the Black Bible. Couldn't find the Bible for these people, for the next person to take the witness stand. That meant the bailiff and the sheriff's deputies and all the court officers had to comb the courthouse. So everyone had to leave this room. Someone had to search the room in order to find the Black Bible for this person to swear to tell the truth on, and they could resume the trial. And that was one of the examples of all the things that they were willing to do. Now I'm going to give you one other example. How many of you have your learner's permit to drive? How many of you have your driver's license to drive? Oh, really? That many? Wow. How many of you want to drive? Every hand should go up. Don't you all want to drive? Eventually, I'll do that. Thank you for indulging me. Well, I'm going to describe to you one other thing having to do with driving that was a law in the South. How many of you, since you have your driver's licenses and you have your learner's permit, have actually been behind the wheel and you found there was someone driving more slowly in front of you and you wanted to get around them? How many of you have been in that situation? Probably everybody, because you want to go fast, right? And actually, to tell you the truth, if you're driving and there's someone going more slowly in front of you and you're about to hit them, the wise thing to do would be to get around them, wouldn't it, when you say? You'd agree with me on that, right? Well, actually, if you were, believe it or not, African American in the South, throughout much of the 20th century, believe it or not, it was against the law for a black motorist to pass a white motorist on the road, no matter how slowly that person was going. Now, can you imagine that level of patience and self-control it would take to not pass somebody who's going so much slowly than you are, that it's almost not safe? And yet that was what was the reality of life for people in that situation. Now, I told this to a high school in Hawaii, very, very far from here. And when I told them that, they were not as well controlled as you all here have been, and I so appreciate your good manners. They actually got upset at what I said when I described this about the driving. One of them said, there's all this ruckus in the room when I told them this, and they actually said, one of them said, well, I would have honked. And I had to say to them, let me start again. If you couldn't pass the people on the road, you couldn't honk to make them go faster. Obviously, this is a very natural reaction of what are you going to do. And when I told the students in Hawaii that you couldn't honk, then they got upset at that too. And then another one said, well, I would have tailgated. I wouldn't have made any noise, but I would have tailgated to make them know that they needed to go faster. And when I said you couldn't tailgate either. If you couldn't pass them on the road, if you couldn't honk to make them go faster, you couldn't tailgate either. In other words, you had to stay in your place. That's what it means to be in a caste system. A caste system is an artificial hierarchy in which people are assigned a role based solely on what they look like, and that was what was going on in the American South for much of the 20th century. And so when I told the students that, in this particular class, they actually, then another one said, well, I would have left then. And I said, that's my sentiment exactly. That's what 6 million Americans did as a result of their desire to have freedom within the borders of their own country. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that means for all of us, too. One of the things it means for us is it's an inspiration to think about how far people are willing to go to be free. These people left in the same ways that people crossed the Atlantic to get from Ireland and from Germany and from Italy to get to the United States, or from China or Japan or from Vietnam or from wherever across the Pacific Ocean or crossing the Rio Grande. All of the people who make up what we know as America had to have had something in the back of their minds similar to what I described to you, just for us to be here. And when they left, they often left at the ages close to where you are, believe it or not. The age of people making this great decision to leave ended up being mainly in their teens and early 20s. They were very young people, just at the start of life, thinking about what do they want to do. And they didn't want to live in the strictures, in the restrictions of the world that they were in. And so they set out on this journey far, far away. These are the grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents of all of us here. We wouldn't even be here if they hadn't had the vision to do that. We wouldn't be growing up in worlds where we can have the freedom to do the kinds of things that we can if they hadn't made that choice. Let me tell you a little bit about, too, what it meant for these people to go and why I think it's an inspiration for all of us. For one thing, this was the first time in American history that the lowest caste people in our country, African Americans in the South, for much of the time in the history of this country, this is the first time that they signaled that they had options and felt that they had options and were willing to take them. And yet the South didn't make it easy for them to go. Do you know that when they attempted to leave, the South actually tried to keep them from leaving? They would actually arrest people on the railroad platforms, people who had tickets to bring them up to New York, or to Washington, D.C., or to Boston, or to Chicago, or Detroit, or Cleveland, or out to Los Angeles. They would actually arrest them from the railroad platforms. They would actually arrest them from their train seats. These are people who had tickets, already paid for their tickets. And when there were too many to arrest, they would actually wave the train on through, so that people who had been waiting and hoping and praying for the chance to leave had to watch that train to freedom leave without them, and then figure out, how now will we get out? How now will we get to freedom? And they had to find and devise other ways in order to get free. This happened within our own country, within the lifespan of people in all of our families today. This did not, it began in World War I and didn't end until the 1970s. So that's getting into the lifespan of parents and grandparents and people of all of the school here. And so thus, this is not ancient history, but this is living history. Now, this is also the first time in American history that the lowest caste people actually had the chance to choose what they could do and where they could live. Just think about this. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and yet until very recently, entire groups of people couldn't even choose what they would do for a living. They were consigned to doing certain kinds of things, consigned to work in tobacco fields or cotton fields or sugar plantations. All of these people, and in those sugar plantations and on those tobacco fields, were actually opera singers and jazz musicians and playwrights and novelists, because that is what they became once they got to be free. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the people who actually ended up being the result of this migration, the result of this journey to freedom, the result of the dreams that their parents and grandparents had. I'll tell you about a couple of them. How many of you have heard of the novelist Toni Morrison? You heard of Toni Morrison? She's a Nobel laureate, obviously, and you all know that. She was someone whose parents were in Alabama, the state of Alabama. But they did not want to stay in Alabama and raise their daughter there, so they decided that they were going to move to a place called Ohio. And once they got to Ohio, that was a chance for her to be able to do something that we all take for granted, but that she could not have done in Alabama had her parents stayed. And that was just to go into a library and take out a library book. Believe it or not, it was against the law. Against the law for people who happen to be African American to just walk into a library and take out a library book. They could not go into a library. Merely by leaving, they assured that their daughter would be able to go and take out a library book. And if you're going to become a Nobel laureate and become a novelist, if you want to be a writer, it helps if you get a chance to read a book now and then, wouldn't you say? I want to tell you about a couple other people, things that wouldn't even exist had there not been this migration. And every single migration leads to things that would not exist had there not been someone who had the vision to take a chance. Such things as, how many of you have heard of Motown? Oh, that warms my heart, my goodness. Motown is a form of a kind of music that would not even have existed had there not been this migration. And Motown and the kind of music that grew out of that, and it grew out of jazz, would not even led to the kinds of music that we listen to today, and simply are very ear would be very different had there not been this migration. So Motown was an organization, a recording company that was founded by this man named Berry Gordy. His parents were from Georgia. They migrated to Detroit. When these people migrated, they migrated under very specific streams. In the same way that you find there are a lot of people from Ireland who are now in Boston and in Chicago, and you go to Minneapolis, and there are lots of people who are from Scandinavia, and you go to the north end of Boston, you find there are a lot of people from Italy, and that's because people, when they migrate, they go to specific places. And so because his parents, Berry Gordy's parents, were in Georgia, Detroit was one of the places that they would have wanted to go because that's where the trains went. In any case, when he grew up in Detroit, got to be a grown man, it turned out that he wanted to go into music, but he didn't have the ability to play music. He wanted to manage and record people. But he didn't have the money to go all over the country and find the best talent. So what did he do? He looked around himself, and there he was in Detroit, surrounded by all these people who were children of this migration. They were children of people who were from the South. They were children of people who had brought the South with them, on their hearts and their minds, with such music as the blues and gospel music and the spirituals which had sustained them. And when they got to the North, the children heard this music, but every generation remakes itself and remakes the things that it has grown up with. And they wanted to do something different with the music. And so this Berry Gordy saw these children all around him, these young people all around him, who were remaking the music in their own way. And he heard about these three girls, for example. One of them was named Mary Wilson, another one was named Florence Ballard, and then there was a third one named Diana Ross. I don't know if you've heard of her. Have you heard of her? Oh, thank you. I'm just so grateful. You would not even know her name had there been no Great Migration. And that's because her parents were part of this, but they would never have met had they not migrated. The mother was from Alabama, father from a totally different state of West Virginia. They both left their respective states during different years, met in Detroit, married, and had her and her sister, and thus a legend was born. This Berry Gordy also heard about this very, very large family in a place called Gary, Indiana. There were 9 or so kids. There were 5 boys in particular. And the youngest one was very precocious and a very good dancer and singer, and the front man for his brothers. I think you may have an idea of who I'm speaking of. I'm speaking of Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5, none of whom we would even have heard of had there been no Great Migration, because they would not have existed. Their mother was from Alabama, father was from Arkansas, and they came during different decades. Met, married, and moved out to Gary, had all the kids, and thus a whole new legend was born. A couple other people I'm going to mention to you who would not have existed. There are many, many, many people who would not have existed. But one of them, to get more into the 20th, closer to our era of today, one of them was a man who was born as Calvin Broadus. His parents were from Mississippi, and they went to California. Does anybody have an idea who I'm speaking of? Yes, exactly. It was Snoop Doggy Dogg, and then it became Snoop Dogg. Well, I got it. Great, thank you. So some other people that would not even have existed. There was, just to give you a couple more examples. One was a man left Louisiana, went to a place called Minneapolis where he met a woman who would become his wife. They had a son, and they named him Prince Rogers Nelson. He would not have existed had there been no Great Migration, had his father not done what he did. And the list goes on to such people as Tupac and Miles Davis and John Coltrane. Many of these people would simply not even have existed had there been no Great Migration, which is the reason why I often emphasize to people how important it is to think about our every action. Now, I want to just leave you with a couple of things. One of them is that when people migrate, when people in all of our backgrounds do whatever they did to get us to where we are, and each one of us each one of you can think in your background about who in your family did this great, brave thing of crossing an ocean or crossing mountains in order to get here. Think about it. Everyone can think about whoever it was, and think about how they might have never met your great